there, everybody. Welcome. Nice to see you to the degree that I can see you. And I'm doing this class today as a kind of extension of the podcast that's called Both Sides Now. So there's a podcast that's up by this title, and also there's a podcast following it. I think these are numbers 29 and 30, which is on the snow globe of subjectivity. And of course, if you've been in these classes or in any of my other classes, you know that one of the reasons why human beings have such difficulty really understanding each other, that is seeing, hearing, and feeling each other accurately, is because each of us is in pretty much our own world, and that world is anywhere from 45 to 85%, this is based on cognitive science, individual. So that we see things, hear things, feel things, and by that I mean have body sensations as well as emotions in ways that don't agree with each other. So we have different perceptions. Sometimes when people talk about some psychological theories that surround what's called projection, which is that we seem to see in other people feelings or thoughts that we're having ourselves. Sometimes there's a language as though we put these things into other people. We out project them, we put them into others. But I think the reality is more that we experience in our perceptions, we experience other people doing and saying things that they're not actually doing and saying. So there is a kind of illusion, or even if it's extreme, it's like a delusion about our subjectivity. So because of that, it's very difficult for us to talk about topics where we have a strong difference, and also to talk with people that seem to have hurt us or harmed us, or what we attribute as having intentions against us. So knowing that you are enclosed and I am enclosed in this sort of snow globe, and when the snow globe is shaken up, we pay a lot more attention to our own snow than we do to what somebody else is hearing, or somebody else is saying, or somebody else looks like. And I've said this in many different ways, but I feel like I can't say it too often because people forget it instantly. And on some of the questions that I've had about the courses that I've been doing have to do with something like this. You know, if I'm talking to a racist, how can I learn anything from the racist? Or if I'm talking to somebody, you know, who thinks the world is flat, not round, how can I learn anything from that person? So that's kind of a misunderstanding of the idea of dialogue, which we're going to talk about today. So dialogue is actually an attempt on the part of one person to see into the other person's snow globe. That does not mean that you have to agree with it, that you will change your mind, or that you will see anything differently from the point of view of your own values. It simply means that you develop the capacity to hear what someone else is saying from their point of view. Now, I would call this intersubjectivity rather than objectivity, because arguably objectivity is something that requires a real consensus, like, you know, do 2 and 2 always equal 4? And usually we have a consensus about those things. But if I'm going to try to step into your point of view, I don't have to actually get your total agreement, in that when I say back to you, I hear you saying this, or this is what I'm understanding you saying, but you have to actually agree to the point that you say to me, you've got it, you've got it, you've got my point of view, you can see how it looks. So this notion of subjectivity, that we're inside of a snow globe, is one part of why it's difficult to talk with others who disagree with us. And the other part, which I've focused on quite a lot, is that we have emotional reactions when somebody begins to talk to us about something that feels threatening. And it could be threatening because it has something to do with us personally, or it could be threatening because the point of view is just diametrically opposed to our own. And so when we're feeling emotional threat, we tend to protect ourselves and promote ourselves. And we do that automatically through limbic system reactivity, the fight flight reactivity. Either we want out, we want to get out of the conversation, or we fight, that's not true, I don't believe it, or we attack the other person, humiliating them, in which case then they may become enraged, and then both of us get into the humiliation-rage cycle. So a lot of the public discourse these days, having to do especially with the issues surrounding the COVID-19 virus, about whether wearing masks is actually effective, either in protecting others from your germs or being protected, whether isolation, social distancing is effective, or whether the statistics that you get about predictions are true or not. Those kinds of conversations often turn into the fight or flight kind of conversation. Instead of actually hearing what the other person is saying, instead of stepping in and trying to understand their point of view, there might be the walk away from it, nope, don't want to talk about it. Or there might be the fight, which is something like this: you don't know the statistics, you haven't got the science right, you didn't read this report. And of course, that way of responding to somebody else's point of view, if you say it particularly with a contemptuous or dismissive attitude, will evoke rage, and then they will attempt to humiliate you. You don't know what you're talking about, you so-and-so, and you enter into the rage and humiliation cycle. There is no communication then, it's all fight and flight, and there's no actual understanding of what the other side is saying. So today I wanted to talk about the importance of being able to step into someone else's point of view for a number of reasons. And one of those I think is perhaps the most important, is at this point in this process of being socially isolated, being separated from being able to assemble together and have conversations, we have, I would say, a certain degree of paranoia about others in our species. We may be regarding them as contagious. We may be regarding them as dangerous. And so instead of regarding them as our friends, whereas, in the past, as I've mentioned a number of times, you might have a friendlier attitude towards strangers than towards the members of your family, because you have fewer ongoing conflicts with strangers. Right now, you might not have that attitude towards strangers. And right now, as we're coming out of the period where we've collected data and we now have data on what this illness actually is, we don't perhaps know exactly how it got going, but we have good data sets from different cities and from different universities. Right now, we need to talk to each other. And we need to talk to each other about a lot of things that would involve how we're going to plan for the future, how we regard various kinds of safety measures, anything from what's the nature of 5G and the radiation connected to 5G, to what's the nature of vaccinations, how safe are they, what's the nature of vaccinations against coronaviruses, what can we do in the future if a pandemic comes along? Why have we failed so badly with long-term care centers, where so many people, I saw today in The Guardian, that most of the deaths worldwide are in long-term care centers. And so, you know, why have we failed so badly? The people who are our elders, who are being cared for in something called a care center that ended up being a non-care center. So there are lots and lots of conversations that are going to be triggering. They're going to be emotionally threatening that we have to have right now because we need other points of view. Again, getting back to the snow globe idea, you're enclosed in your own points of view. You do not see the bigger picture. One of the best things you can do is talk to people who are different from you, who have a different point of view, not to change their mind, not to convince them of your own point of view, but to find out why they see things the way they do. Now, I know I've spoken a number of times here and in my podcast about the fact that if we want to solve any of the world's problems, we have to deal first and foremost with our own species. I would say in general, we are not fans of our species. We seem to be fans of the other species like the dolphins and the elephants and various kinds of domestic pets. We like our dogs, and we may also like the goats and the cows here in Vermont. But when it comes to humans, you know, the Homo sapiens, we seem less interested in really understanding the species and working with our species. So in order to solve problems having to do with climate change, with world population, with management of immunity and illness, with any of the big issues that are in the public domain, we need to work with our own species. And it's through that process of being able to have what I'm going to call real dialogue with our species that we can solve the problems that our species has. The other way to go, in the way that I'm afraid has failed us badly, is to try to impose our own ideals on others who disagree with us, and then try to argue for our ideals or our point of view based on evidence that the others are wrong. That does not lead to good outcomes, and I hope you can see it by now. It leads to something called polarization. And if you look up the definitions for polarization, you'll find that they're fairly close to the definitions for war. The difference is that the two sides get armed in war. So they go on being polarized, but they arm themselves, and then one side wants a victory over the other. But the way war has worked out is there's rarely been any victory. Most wars are ongoing. Mostly after they start, they keep going. And mostly nobody knows what they're about after a while. So the option of getting polarized and then going to a war over your ideals is just not an option that I think is a good one anymore. I don't think it's worked, and I don't think it can work now. So that means that the only choice we have in terms of working with both sides is dialogue, is trying to understand what's going on with the other side, try to make sense of it from the point of view of the other side, in order to get the information of what the other side is thinking, feeling, and what's going on with them. So that's what this program today is about. And some of what we're going to talk about, we've already talked about a bit, but some of it will be new. So the very first slide we're going to put up, I think I've shared this in these earlier free classes that I've done. And this is the class on, this is the slide on mindfulness and compassion. And so I'm going to go over this again so that you recognize again what mindfulness is, that it's a kind of awareness that combines concentration and equanimity and leads to clarity of perception. So I'm going to break that down, that a kind of awareness means that it's a way of using your attention. And mindfulness is an awareness that you can cultivate. It is not a skill that comes automatically for human beings, although concentration can come automatically, but when it's cultivated, you can make it last longer. So concentration is your ability to pay attention in a single pointed way. You can focus on something, continue to focus on it, and use your awareness to focus on it as long as you want. And the problem with concentration is if it becomes too concentrated, often you get jittery. It's like if you drink too much caffeine and you get jittery. So the other side of mindfulness is something called equanimity, a big word, but it's a good one, which means a friendly attitude, like a matter-of-fact attitude, a friendly attitude towards your experience. It really means that you're relaxed, you're open, your eyes and your ears are open. So mindfulness combines concentration, your ability to pay attention to the object of your awareness, with this relaxed equanimity that remains open even when there's pain, even when there's agitation. And those two together lead to greater clarity in your perception. So they allow you to keep your eyes and ears open while you are distressed or even when you are in pain. So mindfulness is a cultivated kind of awareness. You practice it, you develop it. I'm teaching a course on a real dialogue right now, and real dialogue is a form of cultivating mindfulness when you're in conversation. So mindfulness is a part of having a dialogue with somebody you disagree with that you need to build your mindfulness skills for. It's like building your muscles when you exercise. Compassion, which is the other component of having a difficult conversation, is something that you're born with. And I like to mention this because a lot of times people think they have to develop their compassion. Actually, all of us have the desire to help others when they're suffering or to help others when they are in some kind of difficulty or pain. Now, we can corrupt that desire, we can ignore the desire, but because we're born into a relationship of dependency on another, we have to be able to engage with that other, to soothe that other, to get that other to a point of being able to help us and be interested in us. Again, lots of research on mother-infant interaction right after birth, also research on twins interuterine who soothe each other in the uterus. And so being able to stroke each other's arms, help each other with painful situations. So you have an inborn compassion. You also have another thing that will help you in a dialogue, which is curiosity. That's a primary emotion. All humans are born with curiosity, which is an interest in something. We're able to go into it because we're interested. It's an expansive emotion. So mindfulness is something you have to cultivate. Compassion is something you have. You put those together with curiosity, you should be able to talk to somebody who has opposing points of view. So that's just a sort of starting point. And then I want to say one more thing about the importance of opposing points of view, and then we're going to talk a little bit about real dialogue and what it is. So I know that I have mentioned this in the podcast many times, so if this is review for people, please bear with me. There are certain things that I think cannot be said too often. And one of those is that this world that we're in is an ambivalent world. This is the world of life and death, good and bad, control and surrender, humility and narcissism. Those things are, they're together. They come in together, they're bound together. They're always in our experience together. When we split them apart is when we get in trouble. When we want things to just go well, when we want life but not death, when we want surrender but not control, etc. We split apart these opposites and then we prefer one over the other. That's when we suffer terribly. And so in any argument or in any debate, there are important things on both sides. There is never just one side. And so even in the areas of things that we don't really think are in any way ideal, that would be, for example, racism. There are fears that human beings have that they build into a framework where they become afraid of others who look different from them. But when you can see what the roots are in their perceptions and you understand why they fear what they fear, you can begin to understand how human beings come up with perspectives that are destructive. But without knowing that, all you have then is a projection of what you think that other person is thinking. So even in conversations where you're talking to someone who has a point of view that you find destructive, that you find damaging, if you can actually step in and try to understand what it looks like from their snow globe, you will learn something. So here's where I'm going to say a thing that Carl Jung, and I'm a Jungian analyst, Carl Jung said it many times, and I meant to look this up to see where he got it because it was from, I think, an early Christian saint. But the phrase is, nothing human is alien to me. Nothing human is alien to me. And that has to be at the basis of getting to know your species. That you recognize that if somebody else is having a point of view, having an experience, it's not alien to you because you're also human. You also are hardwired for the fight and flight. You want to protect yourself and promote yourself. You have a snow globe. You have the primary emotions, the secondary emotions. Why not find out what that other human being is experiencing? Again, not to agree with it, not to endorse it, not to change your mind, but simply to find out so that you can begin to work with the other instead of wanting to obliterate the other, eliminate the other. This is your species. Why not find it part of yourself? So in going into the opposites, knowing that opposites reside together in this world that's called samsara in the Buddhist language. And what that means is that in this world, nothing is perfect, nothing is permanent. And nothing is really personal. There are so many causes and conditions that you don't control that are not personal to you, not personal to me, not personal to that person who has very different points of view than you have. So this world that we're in, it requires real dialogue if we're going to survive in it without going to war. And it requires that of each of us, not just an expert. Because as we go into this period of time that we're going into now, each of us has to be responsible for our own rights, our own health, our decisions, the decisions we're going to make about our community, and ultimately the decisions that we make about our country. And then, if ever we are called upon to make decisions about our species, then about our species. But as we move into this time, we're going to have to work together, which means not imposing on others our ideals. So I hope that's clear. So for about the last, I don't know now, it's been about 3 years, I've been working on a project called Real Dialogue. And that project is meant to be a cultural movement as well as a skill and a method. As a cultural movement, it's a movement away from war towards dialogue. In order to make that movement, I believe we have to understand what the Homo sapien is and what the species tends to do when faced with difference, when faced with threat. So real dialogue is actually, I'm hoping, a movement that will get some legs in this period of time. And it's a what I would call a mindfulness in relationship movement. There are 3 components to it, and Lori's going to put up the slide now of the 3 components, and then we're going to break it down and talk about each component and how these can help you in actually having a dialogue with another person on opposing sides and differences. So I'm going to talk about in greater depth the skill in a moment, but the skill is made up of 3 components: speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, and remaining curious. Those are the 3 components to the skill of real dialogue that one uses for oneself in conversation with others. That skill may or may not be on the other side of the table. The other person may not have the skill, but even if the other person doesn't have it or isn't practicing it, the skill can help the person. It's like mindfulness, you know, if you have the capacity to pay attention mindfully, it will help you even if nobody else has that capacity. So the skill helps you even if you're talking to someone who doesn't actually have it. The method of real dialogue is a facilitated conversation in which there are 2 co-facilitators who are real dialogue specialists. We've been teaching real dialogue as a method, as a facilitated conversation. It actually comes from a form of couples therapy that I originated with my late husband, Ed Epstein, back in 1984. It's called Dialogue Therapy for Couples. I've written books about it. I'm working on another book about it right now, but my most recent book, Love Between Equals, is about relating in partnership through that method of real dialogue. And the third part of real dialogue is the practice of it. We hope eventually that there will be worldwide communities of people who use the method as a facilitated conversation and people who learn the skills. So now I'm going to stop for some questions, Lori, but we'll then put up the in-depth slides on each one of these, on the skill, the method, and the practice. But I think I'll pause for a moment and take any questions that, are you having people chat to you today, or?
Yes, yep. And we do have a question. So one of them is, what do we do when having judgment about folks who not only disregard wearing face masks, but disregard someone's physical safety? So in this time.
Well, the very first thing I would say is recognize that your point of view is subjective. That's always a good first step. Realize that you don't know exactly what other people's safety is. I mean, I can say, because I posted on Pay Attention, which is my curated site on my website, that the science behind wearing face masks, that means wearing either the cloth masks or the ordinary paper masks that people wear out in public. The science is very, very mixed, to the degree that the World Health Organization never supported it, because ordinary people don't know how to use face masks and they don't use them well typically. So for most people, it is thought about as protecting others from your germs. Even that is a dubious, that from what again, the World Health Organization says, unless it's skin tight on both sides, it's a dubious proposition. So it seems to help people feel psychologically at ease, and a number of places have mandated it. But I think it's important to keep in mind that those mandated uses are not based on science. So if you have a strong feeling about wearing a face mask and about the 6-foot distance, I think number one, to recognize that these are recommendations by some scientists, not all. Some scientists recommend much more of a development of putting safe populations together to achieve herd immunity, and there have been new things that have come out from the data that we have now that strongly recommend that. And then some scientists are recommending social distancing going forward. I would recommend having a dialogue, which you could have on a telephone, on Zoom, or you could have it at 6 feet distance with someone who disagrees with you. And to come to that position by using some of these skills. We're going to talk about speaking for yourself, We're going to talk a little bit about listening mindfully. And to use these, recognizing that you're talking to somebody from your species and that you need to actually find out how they're thinking and feeling. So I never come into a conversation that has to do with my point of view, thinking that I know everything about that point of view. I can say, here's my point of view, here's my opinion. This is the research I've read. This is the way I remember this. This is what I prefer. This is the way I want to conduct myself. But I can't say, I know the absolute truth. I know exactly where this originated because I know from what cognitive science has told me, and I believe it, I'm 95% unconscious. I have only a 5% working memory. So there's a lot of dark matter in my consciousness, and it gives me a kind of modesty and a kind of humility in saying what I know. And I rely actually on a lot of people as my teachers and my interlocutors and my conversational partners in my very own family. A lot of us disagree. And I talk to everybody who disagrees with me. And I would recommend it as a practice because I learn a lot. So I wouldn't start from a position, I know and I know the facts. I would start from a position, this is the way I look at it. This is the way I remember it. This is my impression. How about you? So you can do that in a socially distanced way. You can do that on Zoom with somebody who disagrees with you. You can do it on the telephone. So is there another question, Laurie?
Yeah, there are a couple more questions. So one of them is, what are some strategies to remain calm during an argument?
That, again, those of you who are taking the class on Real Dialogue, you know that we are going to be practicing those, but in a short answer, the short answer will always be the same. Lower your own level of emotional threat. Lower your level of emotional threat. So how do you do that? You can take a deep breath. You can actually cultivate some other kind of neutral sensation, like the feeling of the air on your face. That's a neutral sensation. Or the feeling of your clothes on your body tends to be neutral sensation. Neutral sensation cultivates equanimity. Equanimity, friendly attitude towards your experience, matter-of-fact attitude, lowers emotional threat. Emotional threat, when it's lowered, deactivates your reactivity through the limbic system and the hippocampus, actually, the parts of the middle brain that cause the fight and flight. You're wanting to lower that. Your organism, when it feels threatened, increases the reactivity, the fight and flight. You, through your consciousness, your little 5% of consciousness will help you out if you can remember to lower that threat level in yourself when you are starting to feel the agitation, like you want to flee or you want to fight. So, if you have some mindfulness practice, you can use that. Sometimes just noticing your breath makes you more anxious. It increases the threat level, so it's not an always to-do thing. But if you can feel the air on your face, almost always that's neutral. If you can do anything else to, as they say, press the pause button, then that can help you lower your threat level. But you can always work with yourself. And folks, you will always be with yourself. And so you will be more responsible for yourself than anybody else for the rest of the time you're walking around with yourself. And so it's a good idea to learn how to lower your threat levels. So that's the way you proceed on that one. So do you think, Lori, I can go ahead then with the three aspects of Real Dialogue, and we
Yeah,
can,
I
okay.
think we can come back to some of these other questions at the end, because some good ones.
Okay, great, good. Thank you. And thank you for the questions. I thought they're In fact, let me just take this moment to say that I'm going to be doing 5 more free classes that are on these topics and some other. They will be in the general kind of framework of making contact and using mindfulness in relationships for the Rowe Center and for Real Dialogue LLC that will be coming up. And those classes are going to be about 10 to 20 minutes of presentation, and the rest of it will be conversation. So each one of those classes will have a lot more Q&A because we have found that people's questions are very good, but it's not easy in a class this size to let anybody jump in. So just so that you know, there will be classes out there with more Q&A, and you can always write me afterwards also through the chat. And I do answer questions after the class is over. So we're going to put up the next slide, which goes into the breakdown of what Real Dialogue is. So first, I'm going to talk about the skill, and those of you who are in the course on Real Dialogue, and by the way, you can still join. There are 6 classes that are alive still. They're all on the skill of Real Dialogue, and the other classes have been recorded, and you can listen to those in preparation for doing the live classes. So the skill is mindfulness in relationship. It helps individuals become tolerant of their perceptions, thoughts, and feelings during emotionally activated conversations so that they continue until both sides are accurately witnessed by each individual. This is called Real Dialogue. So being able to accurately witness another in a state of emotional agitation and activation is the skill of Real Dialogue. It's a test of your mindfulness. When you're able to do it, you will feel tremendous relief yourself that you can actually see, hear, and feel somebody in a way that they can say, yeah, you got it, even though you're emotionally activated. So this type of skill helps you at home, particularly with those you care about, because as I said the other day, unfortunately, listening to somebody in an emotional activated state, when you're emotionally activated and they're emotionally activated, is more difficult to do if you really care about them. So if you want a good outcome and you really want it badly because you care about that person, it's more difficult to do a Real Dialogue than it is with a stranger, even if you really disagree with that stranger, because you don't care that much about the outcome of the dialogue. So learning this skill helps you at home. It also helps you at work. It helps you with strangers, and it can help actually in any kind of conversation, even with yourself. So Real Dialogue is grounded in understanding the human emotional system, the experience and motivation of primary and secondary emotions, and how our emotions affect our perceptions. And it's grounded in contemporary cognitive science and in Buddhist teachings about reality and individual subjectivity. As I mentioned, that we are each in a snow globe of our subjectivity. That's actually a teaching from contemporary cognitive science. I've just put it into colloquial language, and from Buddhism. So in the skill of Real Dialogue in that course, as it's taught, whether it's taught in person or in this online format, it's based on these foundations. So that's the skill, that's for the individual. And then the method is what we teach to people who want to become specialists. So if you want to put the method, that one up, Lori. So here you see a facilitated conversation in the little picture, and that is a coached and structured conversation by 2 trained Real Dialogue specialists that are certified in the Real Dialogue method. It's designed to facilitate difficult conversations where there is a critical need to see, hear, feel each side accurately in order for the 2 sides to work together or make decisions together. The method is used in leadership, executive coaching, life coaching, human resources, and in other relationships or settings in which difficult conversations have become obstacles to decision making. So Real Dialogue, the method, is a facilitated conversation And we hope to put this kind of method on stage to talk about the kinds of issues that are now sort of in the mix in our culture that are polarized. And we call that Real Dialogue for Opposing Sides. There's a Patreon site that we've started to support if you want to contribute to the funding of live conversations that are co-facilitated. Right now, I co-facilitate conversations with some of the people that I've trained. Eventually, we hope to train people all over the world to use this method to co-facilitate conversations on opposing sides for people who are in various kinds of settings. Now, just to be clear, a real dialogue as a method is not psychotherapy. It is not the same thing as dialogue therapy. Dialogue therapy is a form of therapy for couples, but the method of real dialogue is kind of a kernel of dialogue therapy that we've brought out of the therapy context into the context of coaching and facilitating. But when it's set up as a method, it is always a co-facilitated method so that each person has a coach, a facilitator, what we will call an alter ego, which is somebody who uses the psychodrama method called doubling, and also has somebody who can unblock when some emotional blocking is going on. Your coach facilitator switches chairs with your dialogue partner and unblocks that moment and then switches back. So this method is a very activated, structured, co-facilitated conversation. Again, to make another point, if you get into using the method of real dialogue, what happened to the screen there, guys? Okay. Once you get into the method of real dialogue, you see that it is quite different from conflict resolution, from nonviolent communication, and from other methods that attempt to bring harmony by imposing ideals on conversation. This skill of real dialogue attempts to allow each person to understand clearly what the other person is saying, but there doesn't have to be a resolution or a compromise. Once that understanding is reached, then there can be some further conversation if there needs to be, or there can be a separation of the two sides. The point of the method is simply to bring about the ability to witness accurately someone with whom you disagree or someone who has hurt or harmed you. So again, that's the method. That's what we're teaching actively now in the space, particularly for people who want to do executive coaching and other kinds of facilitated conversations, as well as people who want to simply take the skill into the next level. So the practice then of real dialogue is actually the community of real dialogue worldwide, which is joined together by the principles, the skill, and the method. At this point, that community is pretty small. It's the people that I've trained in California, Montreal, Vermont, and that I'm training right now, who are learning the method. And then we have an online community which we intend to expand and develop. Overall, again, my purpose in putting together real dialogue as a movement is to be able to bring into being something that could allow us to avoid the cycle of humiliation and rage that leads directly to war when human beings are polarized, and has always led to war when human beings are polarized. So war may have begun with a battle for resources, but for many eons of time, it's been a principal difference between tribes, where there are different tribes that have different ideals for bringing about a better world or a better situation. And they have then gone into the cycle of humiliation and rage. Humiliation is when your social status is lowered, Enrage is the response to having your social status lowered. And so that becomes a cycle. It's easily developed from polarization and then leads to opposing sides who are armed and go into a desire then to destroy each other. So I'm hoping that this movement for real dialogue will bring about a whole method eventually. I mean, at this point, it sounds somewhat, to me, impossible, but I know how the method works. I've worked with it. I see its promise. It's amazing, moving, touching, to watch a real dialogue, a facilitated conversation between people who have very opposing sides on any of the issues that are on the table right now. So, I'm hopeful that things will go forward. I was kind of very actively working to develop the business, the community, and so on when the virus came on and confined me to home. And so now we're doing it from my office and hoping to do the outreach we need to do. So by the time we go back into being able to be live together, we will be all set to be expanding the method of real dialogue. I'm teaching the skill online. So right now, I'd like to take any questions for the remaining time that we have together. And Lori has some questions, I think,
Yep. Okay.
already.
Yeah. So one of them is, what's the best practice where you are in dialogue with a loved one and you're in a position of equanimity around a difference in a view you hold, but they're upset and judgmental towards you about it. You can't force them to have equanimity.
Yeah,
So
no, you
attacking.
can never control anybody else. You can barely control yourself, so don't try to control somebody else. Yeah, the main thing is that you work with your own emotional threat level and that you learn to speak for yourself. Now, again, without taking the course on speaking for yourself, it's a little hard to convey all the component parts, but they boil down to this. You speak with a great deal of modesty. You speak with that sense of, this is the way I remember it. This is my point of view. This is my impression. This is what I hope for. This is what I'm looking forward to. You stay away from you statements, any characterization of the other person. Even to this degree, something like this, often people say, when you talked to me last Tuesday, you said blah, blah, blah. You don't remember what happened last Tuesday because you're 95% unconscious. The better way to say that is to say, here's what I remember that you said last Tuesday, instead of this is what you said last Tuesday, because that's going to activate in the other person the desire to defend. I did not say that last Tuesday. Then you're off on a sidebar. Yes, you did say it last Tuesday. I mean, that's the kind of thing that derails speaking for yourself. So it's a skill that takes time to develop, and it takes some instruction to develop, and that's why I'm teaching it in this online course. I have 3 booklets that are on my website that have to do with the skill. One is called Speaking for Yourself. The second one is called Listening Mindfully. And the third one is called Remaining Curious. You can download those for $4.95. They will give you some help. It's very hard to learn this without instruction, though. And the reason it's so hard is that you are, like I am, in a snow globe. And you have to learn to work with your own snow globe to some extent. That is, there are certain things that will activate you tremendously. In talking to your grown-up children, that by grown-up, I mean anybody who's like from about 17 to onward, who believe that they also can think for themselves and speak for themselves, maybe even less than 17. But I remember my son at 17 saying, I'm 17 now and I should be able to, and so it sort of stays in my mind. But when you're speaking to your children and you particularly want certain kinds of good outcomes, you need 1,000% skill. And that skill needs to be 2,000% modest. And so if you don't achieve your desired outcome, like the other person cannot hear that you're asking something that you think is simple, like, could you put your dishes in the dishwasher after you eat lunch? You believe you're asking for something simple. They have a whole different world. If they cannot hear it, if it's possible, say, thanks for listening, thanks for listening. And to move away from protecting yourself, defending yourself, promoting yourself, you will have time to go forward with this person, because you will have many, many dialogues with this person that has grown up as your child. So it's a really good idea to stay away from polarization with anybody that you care about. And if you get into the polarization, to very modestly, in some way or another, say, I thank you for talking to me, and I'm just not going to accept that hot potato right now that you've thrown in my direction. I just don't see it that way. It's very difficult with loved ones, especially. You have to be very skilled because you care too much. And again, there are skills that you can build on. You have to practice them. They're introduced in those booklets. Teaching a course, there'll be more courses. And at this point, the best thing is lowering your threat level and keeping a sense of modesty about the way you remember things, about your own impressions, about the knowledge you have, all of that, especially with people you care about. So something else, Lori?
Sure. This goes back to, I think, the method. Someone was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the reason for the two facilitators in that slide that we showed with the four people on stage.
Yeah. Okay. So it's because real dialogue as a method is based on an idea that it's going to be almost impossible for me to convey the complexity of it, but I'm going to use the term, and then you can look it up. The idea is called projective identification. And projective identification is an unconscious communication in which each person is actually projecting and evoking emotional meaning from the other. And there has to be a strong intervention of reorganizing that set of meanings in a short period of time in this facilitated conversation. To give you an example, let's just say, you have two people and one person strongly believes that wearing masks creates a sense of real safety, and the other person strongly believes that wearing masks is a sort of public hoax. So those two people are sitting across from each other. Maybe they've never met each other, but each one has a complete narrative about the other one. And each one is already activated emotionally before you begin the conversation. So each person actually needs a facilitator coach person. That person, it does several things. It's not just coaching and facilitating, and again, hard to explain. But the person who's sitting next to the person is sort of making a subjective, intersubjective, empathic team with that individual. And that real dialogue specialist on that side of the room is actually going to work as a partner with that individual. So that means that in a facilitated conversation, each person has a partner, has a team member, has somebody that is going to try to empathize, to witness, to see deeply into that individual's point of view, and is also going to coach and help that person speak for himself or herself, listen mindfully, remain curious during this conversation. So it gives what I would call a fair and just setup for a facilitated conversation in which each person has an expert who is on his or her team, his or her or their team, or any way you want to say the pronoun, that individual has such a person. And from my point of view, that's the best way also to do dialogue therapy for couples, is which with a co-therapist team. That's the way we did it always in the first years. But now it's very difficult to get 4 adults in the room. And so we've switched to solo therapists who switch back and forth between the chairs. But the original setup was that each individual has a partner. And that's the way the method works now. It works very well. I wish you could all see such a facilitated conversation. All of the training that we've done, we've never had a video that we've been able to make and get the permission of everybody to be able to put it online. So we don't have that. There are snippets of dialogue therapy videos online with co-therapists. And if you look those up, you'll see some examples. I think there aren't there, Lori?
On the YouTube channel, yeah.
On the YouTube channel. So there's some example there of a co-facilitated therapy session with a couple on the YouTube channel. So yeah, that's the reason for the co-facilitators, so that it's a really fair setup for both people who are entering into a difficult conversation. Is there anything else, Lori, that you want to?
Well, I think at this point it's about 1 minute to 5, so I think we'll have to circle back to the other questions via email, but you will get a response if you sent me a question. And just before we sign off, I wanted to reiterate what Polly said earlier, that this same time next week is going to be the start of these conversational classes with Polly, where she'll dive into a topic in the first 20 minutes, and then it will be a lot more Q&A and a lot more of a chance for people to ask their questions live. The first one is going to be using mindfulness in relationships, how you can make difficult conversations easier and more engaging. So I think that's sort of the beginning of some of the stuff we touched on today. So that'll be next week at 4 p.m. Eastern. And this Saturday is the next class in Living Together Without Falling Apart, the real dialogue class that Polly's been talking about. That's at 11 o'clock. And there are recordings of the previous classes, so you can check those out. They're available for sale on the website for the first 4 sessions that we've had. So take a look at that, and we hope to see everyone at the next set of classes.
And thank you so much for being here. And one other thing I wanted to add about the class is that the class this Saturday is on Speaking for Yourself. And there will be 2 classes on that, then 2 classes on listening mindfully, and 2 classes on remaining curious. Those are the true deep dives into the skill of real dialogue. What I'll be doing on my next Monday class is I will be talking about mindfulness. And I'll be talking about, and I may talk about some meditation approaches to mindfulness and how to bring it into relationship. But if you really want to learn real dialogue as a skill, please come into the class. There's still, I was really sort of setting the foundation for it. The other ones are available on tape, and there's still room in that class. And if you really want to learn the skill, and especially if you'd ever want to learn the method, I'd strongly encourage you to jump in now. So thanks so much for being with me and your questions, and I'll answer them after this. And thanks again.